So the way I've designed my presentation today, I will first give a brief commentary on three key concepts that are essential to discussing the literary text I've chosen for today's presentation. Namely, the first one will be postmodernism, but only insofar as it relates to knowledge, how we know what we know, how we justify what we know as knowledge according to postmodern epistemology. The second one will be historiography and the literary genre, historiographic metafiction. And the third and last one will be the post-truth condition. And after that, I'll be analyzing the text, Peter Ackroyd's Fall of Troy, in terms of these three concepts. So postmodernism has been, without a doubt, one of the most controversial topics in academia, or perhaps I should amend that statement and say it used to be, because for several decades, so many people had so much to say about it, for or against it, that people in general have grown tired and jaded with the concept altogether, and B, it seems as if there's not much left to say, because there has been a tremendous outpouring of both academic and non-academic opinions on it. And C, we perhaps no longer live in the postmodern era, but the post-postmodern era, assuming that postmodernism did really happen, and we are now experiencing what came after it. But whatever the reasons are for why it's not as fashionable to talk about postmodernism as it used to be, I nevertheless do believe that there is some merit in revisiting it as we live today in an almost universal socio-political climate where truth claims abound and clash sort of ad infinitum, and nobody seems to be able to agree on anything anymore, hence the topic I've chosen for today. Just to put it out there to lay the groundwork, postmodernism, or more precisely postmodern epistemology, argues at its core that there is no objective or objectively acceptable truth or reality, and that whatever is put forth as true or real is merely the product of socially conditioned assumption. Looking at this definition, it wouldn't be a far-fetched conjecture to assume that postmodernism clashed with almost all of the traditional ways of thinking and conduct, because it most certainly did. But there was another tradition postmodernism clashed with, and it was the scientific tradition, sort of this grand accumulation of knowledge and methods from the scientific revolution onwards. And it did so on the grounds that if representations are socially constituted, it was not a big step to question the validity, the objectivity, and neutrality of science. For postmodernism, science is not at all free from the same structures of hegemony that infiltrates, recasts, and weaponizes purely for its own interests all the other forms of knowledge or knowledge-making processes. And the same was certainly true for the way it approached history. Ever since Leopold von Ranke, the German historian who was the first to professionalize and introduce a scientific method into history writing or historiography, there has been a great deal of reliance on archival research and cross-referencing to arrive at historical facts, which is a very lauded and problematic word for postmodernism. Because when you claim that you've arrived at a particular historical fact and you justify the accuracy of your historical research based on the so-called historically authentic sources and material, what you actually mean by that is that you have gone through some documents somewhere, probably some government building or digital archive, but who wrote those documents? Who got to choose which sources to keep and which to scrap? Who gets to interpret those sources, and how do they go about doing it? What about oral histories? What about the versions of history of the defeated, the silenced, the disenfranchised? What of history at large, if there can be, and when there are, multiple versions of it. So these are some of the fundamental questions postmodernism posed to counteract historical truth claims. And not surprisingly, postmodernism begot, so to speak, a reasonably delimitable literary genre called historiographic metafiction, a fiction that is aware of its historical fictionality, plays freely with it, and in fact counts on it to make the ultimate point that so-called real historiography can get as arbitrary as writing a self-aware, historically fictional text. Historiographic metafiction refuses the view that only history has a truth claim, both by questioning the ground of that claim in historiography and by asserting that both are discourses, human constructs or signifying systems, and both drive their truth from that identity alone. Of course, historiographic metafiction never shies away from outright parodying historiography by completely rewriting whatever is traditionally accepted to be true about a particular historical phenomenon. It lets you know that it is fiction, and in doing so, it negates itself along with the truth claims of historiography. Well, does it really? Certainly not always and not necessarily, but it allows the reader to see things in a different light from a different perspective. And if anything, it encourages one to not accept any proffered knowledge as is without expending any mental effort on their own part. Now, it's important to begin this particular section by saying that post-truth politics or the post-truth condition is not at all a new phenomenon. Humankind has always employed various lingual and other methods to propagate a particular stance as a truth to adhere to and live by. The post-truth phenomenon typifies Homo sapiens, and our power is rooted in our ability to create stories and fabrications and then believe them, like myths, religions, and ideologies, which enable the creation of cooperation and ties between complete strangers. But what is new about the post-truth condition in our day and age is the interconnectedness, efficiency, diversification, and speed of the post-truth claims that are communicated thanks to the advancements in technology. In other words, it has never been this easy to lie, and it has never been this easy to find so many people believing a lie so enthusiastically. As long as a lie appeals to emotions and to one's sense of identity strongly enough, it's good enough to be taken to be true. What is often presented as true today is only true in being a reaffirmation of a pre-existing frame of thought. New pieces of information seldom function to revive systems of thought. They, more often than not, only function to justify them. Now, Peter Ackroyd's The Fall of Troy provides a highly workable canvas, so to speak, on which to apply all the discussions so far. In the text, we have a German archaeologist, Heinrich Obermann, leading the excavation of a site which he zealously believes to be the ancient city of Troy. Very early on in the text, in the first few pages, we see Obermann at their wedding ceremony with Sophia, his wife-to-be, and her parents. Here we are given the first glimpses into his mindset. For one thing, he seems to be unable to stop talking about and referencing Greek mythology, whatever the subject of a conversation is. He keeps drawing analogies between mythological characters and events and real-life people and events. For example, he eloquently likens Sophia to the Greek goddess Athene simply because she is Greek and she is interested in Homer. This does seem like an unremarkable, sort of exaggerated compliment at first, but we soon find out about his fervent submission to Homer's historical authority. He makes absolutely no effort to conceal his avowal of the historical accuracy of Homer's Iliad. For him, whatever is contained in Iliad is historically true. For example, during a conversation with Sophia, his wife-to-be at that point, she mentions that no shields or swords have yet to be found at the excavation site, which suggests that Troy might not be the warrior nation depicted in Iliad. Obermann's emotionally driven reaction reveals the extent to which he holds on to Homer's Iliad as a text to live by. And he says, if Homer is wrong, then I am wrong, which is an extremely problematic statement because neither can be the case, because Homer, for him at least, can not possibly be wrong. So by extension, he himself cannot be wrong either. He then reminisces and calls back his childhood memories of listening to his father recite Homer's poems. He says he lived and believed that poetry, almost as if to say that that's enough to establish something as a historical fact, which is a typical element of most historiographic metafiction, as it criticizes the arbitrariness and bias that are often embedded deeply within historiographic endeavors. His actions throughout the rest of the novel revolve around the same preconceived version of history. He destroys artifacts when they go against Iliad, and he counterfeits artifacts to deceive everyone into believing his Homeric history. In one instance, the excavation team finds the remains of a cannibalized child skeleton, but he doesn't even care to look at the remains, let alone consider the possibility that Trojans at some point might have performed cannibalism. His immediate reaction to the cannibalized skeleton is saying that Homer did not write of cannibals. Again, that's proof enough for him to dismiss a physically intact and tangible historical find. And by doing so, he makes it quite manifest that he doesn't see history as something discovered, pieced together, and made sense of with excavations and research conducted today, but rather he sees history as having already happened in a perfect and inalienable form, exactly as it is described in Homer's Iliad, and somehow it falls to archaeology to discover that particular rendition alone. What postmodernism objects to in historiography and the post-truth condition we are all experiencing today are both amply embodied in Obermann's approach to knowledge. The key characteristic here that sort of conceptually binds everything together is self-productivity. Just as ideologies are only concerned with weaving webs of narratives that all point to how right they are, Obermann exerts full control over what gets to pass for history and what does not. And in this politically motivated historiography, truth-seeking does not move in a progressive forward motion. It's counterintuitively backwards. Whatever is here and now should be interpreted sort of backwards, so that a pre-existing system of thought is justified. And when there's nothing or not much to interpret conveniently, it has to be fabricated. So truth-seeking is nothing more than to seek whatever ways that are necessary to reinforce a preconceived notion of truth. For Obermann, archaeology must serve Iliad and not the other way around. At face value, there seems to exist a correlation of a sort between postmodern epistemology of the late 20th century and the post-truth condition of today. In fact, there have been a number of academics who wrote about a causal relationship between the two, blaming postmodernism for paving the way for the socio-political culture today that mass manufactures half-lies and half-truths, lies nonetheless. But it's viable to take a step farther back than to look at this relationship so closely. It may just as well be the case that postmodernism only resulted from the paradigmatic shift that occurred after the world wars, both of them. And when the conditions were ripe, the same shift also gave rise to the post-truth condition. And that shift was a crisis of truth that shook the very foundations of sense-making for everyone. The postmodern reaction rests on the realization that the crisis of truth cannot be abandoned through relativizing truth, but only through the abandonment of the notion itself. With post-truth, however, we see not the application of the postmodern stance on truth, that there can be no truth, but its polar opposite. We see an endless series of willful attempts to cling to hasty versions of truth that are then immediately weaponized to offset the pressure exerted on it by opposing versions of truth. While postmodernism seeks to categorically abandon the very concept of truth altogether, post-truth condition serves only to deepen and perpetuate the crisis of truth. And if anything, it serves to perpetuate the appropriation of truth that postmodernism problematizes, to ultimately argue that there is no longer any truth worth speaking of. What there is instead is the play of meaning, of discourse, of power, and of words. Teşekkür ederim. Sunumumun sonuydu bu.